Okay, so we have from this way down Dominick Pace, GroupM investment lead. Some of you probably heard of Mindshare. Then we have Ann Ramsell, VP of Planning at dentsu X, and Brett Richardson, Senior Media and Marketing Manager at Chobani. Thank you all for doing this thing, making the time.
Thanks for having me.
For those of you who might have read my stories online but have never seen me in person, your luck just ran out. So just to start out, because everyone else, the panel, they've done an audience poll and that kind of thing. Just to show hands, how many people have heard of the term marketing funnel? Okay. All right, so we're nowhere, because I did some research that's only been around for like 100 years, as far as I can tell. I'm not making that up. So we're pressed for time. There's a lot of ground to cover on this. And we're thinking, well, maybe we'll show some campaigns first, and we'll work our way. It's just so much to cover. We decided to just get right into the discussion, which again is what the Media Post conferences are all about. As we go through it, though, on the panelists, when we get to a talking point, and we have like 7 or 8 of them, hope we make it through them. If there is a specific campaign that comes to mind, absolutely feel free to weave it in, because that would be interesting to hear as well. Okay. So when we did our prep last week, and we said, all right, how would you go about this? Because it's, 100 years ago, the marketing funnel maybe had 2 different, ways to reach people to get them into the funnel and squeeze them down to the bottom. But now, of course, with digital coming along, it's a whole lot more complicated. Now, that means more options to getting things done and all, but it certainly has made a little bit wider funnel from what I can tell. That's what it looks like to me. So when we were doing our prep, Ann, you mentioned we were trying to figure out what is the funnel. Do you guys actually talk about the funnel when you're at work and that kind of thing? You mentioned the day in the life of the consumer, okay? And about it being less about where they are in the funnel than looking at the consumer and how they're thinking about your product and where they're making decisions. And I think some of the key wording was moment of receptivity. And then that goes to the message of personalization. Could you just vent some of your thoughts on that?
Sure. Hi, everybody. It's nice to see everybody in the room. Yeah, we were talking about let's talk about video, and then we'll talk about digital, and we'll go through the funnel. And I was like, wait. Video is no longer thought of as just an upper funnel channel. If we talk about it in that way, we're missing the entire point of what building a full funnel strategy is about. And that's starting with the consumer and what their journey is for your particular product. For example, one of the brands that I work on had been buying evening news as one of their big awareness drivers. And when we did the full funnel experience and figured out how is their consumer actually finding their product? Well, their product is only sold in stores, at checkout counters, and it's an impulse product. I'd like a show of hands of somebody who sees an ad for an impulse product at 8 p.m., 10 p.m. at night, and immediately goes to the store to go buy it. Can you raise your hands?
Have you been drinking, or is that... That changes things.
Right. Nobody raised their hands for the record, because that's not how things work. If you see an ad at night, you're not going to jump up and go buy the product. You're going to forget about the product by the time that you're in a store, potentially later in the morning on the way to work, which is a lot of where people buy our product is during commute time. So maybe the first opportunity might be 8 to 10 hours later. It could be almost 24 hours later that they have access to your product. So why would we be buying an upper funnel channel as an awareness driver that's so far away from the actual purchase cycle and journey that they're going on for your product? We instead started using out-of-home video as a place where we could reach them that was close to retail. We started thinking about upper funnel channels like radio as the first place that they would hear about our product, because the purchase cycle on the product needs to be incredibly short. They need to already be out of their house to get the inspiration and reminder that you exist. And then we need to have them close to retail to immediately have the impulse decision made. And the further away we got from that cycle, the less valuable the investment became. So when we're thinking about full funnel strategy and building out a plan, it starts with the consumer journey and where they're making the decisions to buy your product. And then we pick the channels and where they fit in the funnel based on that. So if your purchase cycle and your audience is actually shopping from video, it's no longer an upper funnel channel for you. It's a conversion or consideration channel for you, and you better make it shoppable or you're gonna miss the sale. So it's no longer channels fit in a certain part of the funnel, and it's more about how are you using the channel? How is your consumer using the channel? And how do you then make an entire plan from awareness through that drives that action?
So before I ask for comments, is there any specific medium that is strictly awareness now?
Not that I can think of, because even audio, a lot of audio now has immediate calls to action for purchase. If you have a direct-to-consumer product especially, there's a lot of consideration that's happening, even in awareness channels. So I think it really does depend on the product and how it can be purchased. In my example, the product can't be purchased online. So you only have one choice of where to buy it. You really do have to drive to retail at that point. But I think it's different for every product. And if you all are really great marketers, which I know you are because you're here, and you wouldn't be here if you weren't trying to better yourselves and constantly educate yourselves, you know your product cycle and how people are making their decisions. And I would love for you to just think about how are you using your media plan to actually drive those decisions to happen.
So Brett, your thoughts on this?
Yeah, I think Anne is spot on. There's two main areas that I think are kind of leading to ultimately some just different lenses upon which to look at the marketing funnel. One is it's increasingly convoluted, right? The role of each media channel now, to Anne's point, is very instantaneous in some moments to get from awareness to point of purchase. Consumers also don't care about the funnel. They don't know about the funnel, right? So they see things as, I'm seeing this product for the first time, great, I'm gonna go try it. They're hearing from a friend, there's multiple sources. I think the other piece is that marketers are very much wanting to have everything or have their cake and eat it too. Right, the need for us to link everything that we're doing across the funnel, awareness, traditionally awareness driving tactics, social, et cetera, is all now needing to be grounded in return on investment. And I think that's a really interesting kind of maybe more recent dynamic in how we need to approach the marketplace, and also how we need to get measurement solutions applied as well to really have that full picture and ultimately try to validate success.
Dominick?
Yeah, I'll echo a lot of what was just said. But I think that lens of performance is critical, right? So all media performs, kind of a mantra. It doesn't mean that all media is going to perform in the same exact way, so we shouldn't have the same expectation. A lot of what I was just hearing, though, it brought me this thought of the need to think of diversity. So diversity of our consumer, diversity of what influences their decision. And the reality is that there are many ways to influence the decision. And I think the way in which you use those valuable insights is to inform your audience strategy and your creative. I think that's critically important. I worked on, my first piece of business was enterprise software, where it took 3 years to convert an individual. It's like a toddler, essentially, and I couldn't imagine, maturing a toddler to sell a bar of soap or yogurt each time. So I think, but what's interesting of the parallel is that there is a process that you can follow, and I think ultimately keeping the consumer at the center and thinking about the end-to-end experience is critical. So there needs to be compatibility between your marketing efforts, branding, decom, blockbusters, retargeting, because the consumer is going to see that brand. And I have the great privilege to represent some of the most influential brands in the world. Purpose-driven brands that have really changed society, and they're brands that are also looking to move product. And I think to the consumer, it's critical to think about the connectivity between all those messages.
Good. Okay, I think we all agree on that. So let's start getting into particular advertising media. And going back to receptivity. Now, receptivity on the go, okay? Lead into the last couple of miles before the retail store, gas station, TV audio formats, and other out-of-home formats. Out-of-home may sound like it's very, very old, but I think, you know, there's some really cool things you can do with it these days, particularly geo-targeting around retailers and that kind of thing. And what are your thoughts, because, and I think you would agree, audio has got to be part of that. And one of your comments when we prepped was radio is mostly consumed in cars. So what does that tell us, and how do you leverage that?
Yeah, I think this again goes back to what I was saying before about knowing where you need to speak to people and what's going to move them best. So I often don't think about where the placement is, and out of home is one of those ways that we've categorized media as the location where it's consumed. But what other media channel do we talk about where it's consumed? Like, is mobile a different thing when you watch your phone at home, or when you're like somewhere else on an airplane? Is it now called mobile airplane media? No, so why is out of home a way that we classify media anymore? It's just another place where they're having a video experience, where they're having an audio experience, where they're having a display experience. And so when I'm planning a full funnel plan, I actually oftentimes won't put out of home on the plan as out of home for my clients, because they do immediately get, oh, I'm gonna put a billboard on a highway. That's where they go immediately. So I've stopped classifying things in that way when I'm planning, and instead I talk about on the go. Like, that's how I'll call it. On the go display, on the go audio, on the go video. Where can we find them when they're not in their homes, as a way to broaden reach? And again, find the place where they're more likely to have inspiration to purchase. So if you're at a convenience store and that's where you can buy your product, then I definitely want to be in all of the places I can be right outside that moment from happening. And if my client doesn't have already, you know, sold in their mind that that's the right place for them, then I have to find a different way of selling them on that being the right place for them, which means recategorizing the asset to something that they're familiar with. And I've done that with some of my clients, one of them in particular very recently, and they put GSTV on the plan when they were like, ew, gas stations. And I was like, okay, let's not talk about where it's happening. Let's talk about moments of receptivity. Let's talk about steps away from the actual place of purchase. Let's talk about captive audience, audio on. Safe content. When you start positioning in that way, it's like, oh, okay, that's no longer what I thought it was. I'm hearing a lot of buzzwords I like. NFL, wow, I can get near the NFL. And I'm like, yeah, you can't afford it on television, but we can get you near it somewhere else. So that's sort of how I've started to classify different categories that maybe were off-putting before.
I was just going to say, yeah, I love the format first thinking, because if you think about the five senses, right, I think we could all agree that we probably over-index as marketers in hitting some of those senses. But there's been true deprivation during COVID, right? The touch, smell. And I feel like what's important is if you think about how you're showing up as an advertiser by format, you'll have a pretty good understanding of where you're missing out. And when you overlay environment, like out of home, because I think we can agree that the environment, but not necessarily channel, I think there are ways in which you can build one sense on top of another, like say interactivity, that you just can't do in your living room. So I think it's important, at the end of the day, consumers are humans, you know, they observe their environments through the five senses. I think we have to be cognizant that there are ways to influence consumers, you know, with all five senses as opposed to just sight and sound.
100%. And I think that also we as marketers, our fundamental goal or purpose is to make a connection to a consumer, right? And many of these traditional channels give us a great canvas to show our messaging, show our brand, what we stand for. I do think, though, that the level of data that you get back in some of these more traditional channels is, while developing, maybe still a hurdle that I personally would like to see more advances in, especially thinking through the role across multiple channels and multiple marketing touch points so that you can really truly see that consumer journey and understand those connections across the board. So pros and cons, of course, to any decision making that we're doing. And at Chobani, we certainly dabble in, perhaps are not very bearish or bullish, excuse me, against some of those traditional channels.
It's interesting that you say that about the measurement piece because one of my clients has a product that really ebbs and flows in sales based on what's happening in the economy, what's happening, like gas prices will affect their sales. There are a lot of outside influences that are timely that can impact their sales. So we can't do sequential message or sequential testing with them. We can't look at Q1's media plan compared to Q2's media plan and see if there was a difference, because what happened in Q2 or happened in Q1 could drastically change the baseline of performance. So we end up doing a lot of holdouts for them and doing simultaneous tests as a way to see if the media that we're running in a certain market is producing as much volume and revenue during the exact same moment as we're running a completely different type of campaign or different mix in another market. And I think when you're talking traditional media, that's the one that I've found to be the best indicator of performance, is doing these simultaneous holdout tests, because a lot of other data just doesn't really exist in those channels.
Love a good match market test.
I think to that point, unlike the retail media networks, which we're going to talk about probably, where I think of them as also engines for intelligence, yes, conversion, but there's so much intelligence that they have to offer. And you might not see that with the more traditional channels. But I do think on the other side, the input is critical. So utilizing data and audience strategies across traditional channels. So running data-driven linear, addressable, buying out-of-home formats programmatically. Because when we think about the consumer end-to-end, thinking about those touch points, we also want to ensure that we are scaling our dollars and we're connecting, and having a very clear data spine amongst all of those touch points is critical. So I think I totally agree from the traditional point of view that there might not be as many insights coming from. I do think, though, that we can democratize the insights across all channels, including the traditional channels when it comes to targeting.
Good. Okay. All right. So moving on, let's segue another thing we talked about in our prep to demographics and/or psychographics in terms of target audiences and how to reach them. I asked, Brett, I said, is it easier to apply the funnel dynamic to older consumers because they don't consume the same amount of media as younger generations? And I believe you said, yes, it may be easier to capture older people, but they're maybe not as effective. And then you cited something called the stubbornness meter when it came to brand choices. You want to tell us about that?
My trademark term, stubbornness meter. So yeah, I mean, right? I'm an old consumer to some. So I don't want to necessarily, like, from a pure demographic or age perspective. Yes, you can look at maybe, let's say, the 55 plus demographic, and you see in pure data and see through demographic data specifically that their media behaviors are leaning across traditional channels, mostly linear TV especially. However, and if you can efficiently approach that consumer, great, but the stubbornness meter comes into effect. Will you actually be able to convince someone? And I don't really have any data or proof points, but based on my parents and my grandparents, et cetera, they're set in their ways. And so sometimes it's even if you have the data, even if you're able to efficiently and effectively approach those folks, are you going to be able to actually move the needle? Are you going to be able to actually convince people to move from just knowing about your product to truly going through consideration, purchase intent, and finally trying the product?
There's nothing more depressing when somebody on your team looks at you and says, I guess we could go after older consumers like that 40 plus group, and you're like, ugh. Oh, wow, that really hurt. Ouch, older consumers.
Okay.
No comment. I mean, I think intentionality is key, right? And if there's a product that's meant for that specific cohort, sure. I think the reality is, depending on your business, it could be less expensive to reach that older individual, and therefore, you do have to take into account the lifetime value. It might be less expensive to convert that individual. I can't speak to the stubbornness. I'm not that old. But I feel like it might be a little bit more difficult to convert maybe say a younger individual than an older individual. But if they are younger, statistically they will have a longer lifetime ahead, and therefore if you're able to compute the lifetime value and determine if it's worth the investment, that could help guide whether or not you are interested in targeting individuals who are older or younger.
Yeah, and I think the last thing I'll say is I think all marketers are biased towards always trying to go after the youngest consumers possible, right? And it's the shiny thing to try to win over. Lifetime value, I think it plays an important role in maybe justifying that decision. But ultimately, I think there can be efficiencies elsewhere. When you think about, for CPG, perhaps, who are the heads of households, who are the purchase-making or decision-makers within a household, and to your guys' point, again, it's all about that intentionality.
Okay, good. All right, so Brett, sticking with loyalty and lifetime value, you said that you don't really care all that much at Chobani about retention and loyalty because research shows that the brand is very loyal with people, and they tend to be very sticky after the original purchase. So you don't spend a lot on awareness and trial. It's more through retention marketing. You want to walk us through that?
Yeah, absolutely. So at Chobani, I think the products speak for themselves to a certain degree. We see through consumer research and data that once you've tried our products, whether it be yogurt or our oat milks, dairy creamers, et cetera, that people typically stick around. And we're very fortunate and blessed to have that be the kind of consumer truth. And I think the second point that kind of sets up is the fact that, well, we don't have the biggest marketing budgets, right? So we can only do so much with our dollars across brand and shopper initiatives. And so that kind of leads us to where do we need to focus? And what we've seen is that we are most effective in driving incremental new trials and bringing in more people to the Chobani family by sticking to just driving initial awareness, getting the product in front of people, and ultimately having them try it out. So, I think in the future, if our budgets were to grow, a loyalty retention plan very well could be part of our strategy and have more active support against it. But, given kind of some of the current realities, it's just not top of mind.
All right, so Lisa, how are we doing on time?
Standing here.
That's why I asked.
Yeah,
Okay.
if we might maybe kind of go to that best question you got.
Yeah, well, again, I did want to touch on retail media networks because you folks came out with some pretty interesting thoughts and some caveats that you could share with the audience in terms of what you're buying and what you're getting and that kind of thing. I think it would be very helpful if you could share some of those.
Yeah, and I think a lot of it was said well in the session with Lisa and MK, where accountability is key, right? So these are retail networks now selling media, and they're looking for those dollars that may have been spent elsewhere. And where we've been spending those dollars are, it's an industry that's decades old, where there is a lot of rigor. And we, no questions asked, we hold the retail media networks to the same level of accountability. Doesn't mean they'll always deliver, right? There's a lot of room left for transparency. There's a lot of room left for counting dollars, as MK said. So if we're signing a JBP with a Kroger, we want the Pinterest dollars to count for Kroger and for Pinterest because the revenue is shared. Excuse me. I also think retail search, it's an area where a lot of dollars are invested. That should be counting as well. So I think it's just very important to ensure that media standards, following the same inflation trends, brand safety, we don't give them a free pass because of the relationship with as customers. I think that's critically important. And I would say the convergence too. I think, again, there's so much intelligence that the retail media networks hold, and it's very promising to see the convergence of that data on more broader reaching platforms like connected TV, like Amazon, for example. We've purchased Thursday Night Football. We've utilized that data of those who've consumed Thursday Night Football to then inform our retargeting strategies. You'll be able to actually use purchase intent to target Thursday Night Football, copy splitting, come next season. So I think that convergence is something that's very promising. But again, at the top of what I said, holding the networks accountable for the same standards in which you'd hold any other medium accountable.
Is there time for one small build?
Yes.
Okay, I just want to check. The one thing that I want to add is when it comes to retailer search and holding it accountable as a media channel, do that, yes, and look at it as your online distribution. It's not just a media channel. Think about it if you looked at where your revenue is coming from in total outside of media. I'm guessing distribution is one of the largest buckets of revenue providers for you. Now I want you to go to the in-store space in your mind for a second and imagine if all of your distribution that you had on shelf was just behind private label. It didn't have its own shelf set. All of your facings actually were just behind the product that you were competing against. If you're not properly investing in retail search, then when someone goes and shops for your product on a retailer site, which by the way, they oftentimes will prioritize their private label results over yours, it means you're asking people to search behind your competitors, likely a cheaper version of what you're selling, before they get to your shelf set on that search result. So yes, measure it as a media channel, but also think of it as your digital shelf set, or you are missing a huge part of what it's actually providing you.
Anything to add, Brett?
Yeah.
Just for you.
Thank you, Lisa. I think best case retail media is a great pipeline for data and analytics, as well as a source to strengthen manufacturer to retailer or buy-sell dynamics. I think worst case, it's a money grab that has inflated costs, low incrementality, and it's our job to figure out which it is for which retailers and how to best utilize.
All right. Well,